podemos estar más cerca y platicar más a gusto. Les cuento que para la Cátedra Extraordinaria Juana Gutiérrez Haces en Arte Virreinal y Iberoamericano es un gusto darle la bienvenida a la doctora PORRAS. Me parece que su trabajo es también esta oportunidad para hablar y abordar otras temáticas de las que hemos estado trabajando, en específico lo que tiene que ver con esta circulación de las imágenes, de las formas de trabajo, de cómo se entiende la visualidad en el ámbito asiático con su relación con Europa y por supuesto América. Ayer tuvimos una visita con Stephanie en la exposición Somos Pacífico y fue muy interesante también vincular lo que vimos, ¿no? en esta exposición que pueden ustedes ver en San Ildefonso. Yo, antes de darle la palabra, nada más presentarla brevemente. Ella es profesora de Historia del Arte de la Edad Moderna Temprana en la Universidad de Tulane. Su investigación está especializada en la cultura visual y material del norte de Europa y el mundo ibérico entre los siglos XV y XVII. Sus publicaciones más recientes analizan los procesos de movilidad, las redes sociales y las infraestructuras que sustentaron la circulación global de las imágenes y de la cultura material en la modernidad temprana. Ejemplo de ello es su libro The First Viral Images, Martin de Vos, Anchor, Print and the Early Modern Globe, publicado en 2023, y es autora de otros volúmenes monográficos como el de Peter Bruegel, Historical Imagination, publicado en 2016, Art of the Northern Renaissance en 2018, y actualmente se desempeña como coeditora de los 3 volúmenes de Nederlandisch Kunsthistorisch Jaarboek, en los que se enlazan temáticas que incorporan el giro crítico, ecocrítico y los procesos creativos del dibujo en el arte de los Países Bajos y los territorios neerlandeses americanos. Bienvenida, Stephanie.
Gracias por su introducción y a Erin por la invitación. A todos los que me escuchan en inglés, lo siento. I'll try and speak slowly, I'm sorry. In 1590, Domingo de Salazar, the new Bishop of Manila, wrote to Philip II about the artistic abilities of the local Chinese immigrant population in the Philippines, who the Spanish called the Songles. According to Salazar, the mechanical arts pursued by Spaniards have all died out because people visit and buy from the Songles, who are very good craftsmen in Spanish fashion and make everything cheaply. Salazar goes on to detail how the Songles created perfect paintings and ivory sculptures after European exemplars, as well as excelling in bookbinding and other arts. And to illustrate this point, he tells a rather amusing anecdote about a bookbinder from New Spain who arrived to Manila. Oh, no, no funciona. No. Sí. A book, listo, okay. Who arrives to Manila from Acapulco looking to establish business, and he has employed a Songle assistant. This assistant surreptitiously observed him and learned the trade in only a few months. He then undercut his former employer on price and forced him out of business so that the poor bookbinder had to return on the next galleon to Acapulco. Salazar writes that subsequently everybody goes to the Sangle who does such good work, there's no need for the Spanish artisan. I have in my hands a Navarro in Latin, bound by him, which in my judgment could not be bound better in Seville. This kind of story about the local people's capacity for rapid imitation should sound familiar for scholars of New Spain. Indeed, Salazar's account duplicates Spanish narratives from a few decades earlier, which similarly describe the mimetic faculty of indigenous peoples of the Americas. Of course, Bartolomé de las Casas described the images made by the newly converted Mexica after European models as, quote, perfect and as graceful as the most proper and official images of Flanders. Motolinea also recounts how a boy from Texcoco reproduced a papal bull so exactly there seemed to be no difference from the model. And his fellow Franciscan, Jerónimo de Mendieta, wrote that after they became Christians and saw our images from Flanders and Italy, there was no retablo or image, no matter what it is, they cannot portray or reproduce. These anecdotes reveal a number of commonalities. Together, they inculcate a fiction of the indigenous copyist as an automaton capable of collapsing temporal, geographic, and cultural distance via the work of copying. Inventive capacity falls away in these accounts of colonial artistic production. Mimetic aptitude metaphorically represents these subjects' potential for conversion and easy integration within the Spanish Empire. In all of these descriptions, the local artist receives from a European patron a model, typically a printed image, and via skillful copying is able to replicate its iconography. Yet, Salazar's description of Songle artists in the Philippines adds additional facets to this seemingly familiar narrative about indigenous copying. Firstly, there's the acknowledgement that the Chinese immigrants' mimetic faculty has economic repercussions. That is, the mechanical arts pursued by the Spaniards have all died out, and that everyone buys from the Songles. That is, the local's ability to copy is threatening or has already succeeded in driving out Spanish or New Spanish artisans like our poor bookbinder forced to return to Acapulco. Secondly, in New Spain, chroniclers particularly stress printed imagery's role as a model for local artists' instruction in both Christian doctrine and aesthetic conventions. But in Manila, print was not solely a European technology, it was in fact primarily a Chinese one. The first printed images made in Manila, produced around 1593, drew on immigrant labor, technology, and prints imported from China, Spain, and New Spain. And this talk reconstructs the print cultures of early modern Manila, considering these early Filipino printed illustrations alongside a broader corpus of imported European, Latin American, and East Asian prints and print technologies, as well as the shared material practices of carving and incision in ivory and wood by Tagalog and Chinese residents of the archipelago. More than a project of recovery, I suggest that the mimetic faculties praised by Salazar and the diverse print and ivory products of early modern Manila reveal how artists working in the Spanish Philippines negotiated colonial control, tactically positioning themselves and their products within an emerging global marketplace. So just a few years after Salazar's letter to the king, in the spring of 1593, the new governor of the Philippines, Gomez Perez Dasmariñas, wrote to Philip II to inform him that he had granted a license for the printing of 2 versions of the Doctrina Cristiana in Manila, in both Tagalog and in Chinese, to, quote, result in the conversion and instruction of the people of both nations. The Tagalog version, preserved in a single copy in Washington, D.C., contains only one illustration, the title page, depicting St. Dominic in a landscape, holding a lily and an open book. The xylographic technique used to produce this printed page, carving illustration and text on a single block, had been out of fashion in Europe for several decades. But it was typical for an early modern East Asian book, as is the division of the block between an image at the top and the text at the bottom, all surrounded by a dark framing line. Yet the Doctrina's frontispiece also refers to Western book printing via its inclusion of a thick decorative border of curving quasi-vegetal forms, a flattened ornamental scheme evocative of grotesque strapwork, woodcut blocks inserted into similar missionary texts printed in the Viceroyalty of New Spain across the Pacific. The Doctrina and the other earliest books printed in the Philippines reveal how the Songles, that is the immigrant Chinese community, shaped colonial Filipino print culture, responding to both imported Chinese and Latin American exemplars and an existing Chinese book market. So Lucille Chia has suggested there was a Manila community of Manan readers, that is people who bought printed products in Manan, a specific dialect of Taiwan and maritime southern China. And she cites the use of this particular dialect in 2 books, both the Doctrina Cristiana in Letra y Lengua China by Kang Yong, which was published around 1600, and this Juan Cobo, who's a Dominican priest, his Castilian manuscript translation of the Mingxing Baozhang, a popular text in Fujian. Kobo had arrived in Manila in 1588, and he collaborated with local Chinese inhabitants who spoke this Manan dialect, rendering the title of this book in Mandarin would be Mingxing Baojian. And you see the title is written phonetically here, Beng Sim Po Kam, which is the Manan pronunciation of that title, or the phonetic title. In his letters, Kobo records that Chinese settlers in Manila had brought books in their language with them. So we're talking about a local print culture in Minnan and in Mandarin. And the earliest xylographic books printed in the Philippines clearly reproduce several key features of South Chinese book production of the period. So the text and image are carved on one block, which is used to print each page, where you typically have an image at the top and text at the bottom, although that's not always the case. And the whole thing is surrounded by this black line. And we see this format in the pages of Juan Kobo's own publication, which I'm showing you on the left, which has a very long title, so bear with me, which is the Bin Shengzhao Zhenxuan Shilu, the veritable record of the authentic tradition of the true faith in the infinite God, which I'm going to refer to as the Shilu for short. Where the printmaker here you see on the left is the title page, on the right is an illustration of a fable of the crab and the oyster. So by the late 16th century, the book industry of southern China produced a wide range of illustrated texts, from compilations of popular dramas to pseudo-ethnographic accounts of foreign peoples, and even how-to manuals for artists. In 1590, Kobo himself had attempted to prevent a Chinese Christian convert, a bookseller, Pablo He Chu, from returning to China. And only a few years after the expulsion of many thousands of Chinese immigrants of Manila after the so-called Songhai Rebellion, there's also reference to a librero, is what he's called, active in the Perian, named Zun Hu, who's another Chinese bookseller. So Chinese printed books then were very clearly available in Manila, and Chinese immigrants likely made the very first print products of the Philippines. What's unusual is these early Filipino prints are printed on both sides of the page, which is not how books in China were printed in this period. In East Asia, the use of mulberry paper, which is papel ros, right, is what it's called, I believe, in Spanish, which is thinner and more flexible than European rag paper, means that books were usually printed on a single side of a piece of paper and then folded, which you can see on the smaller image here, so that the printed side of each sheet faced outwards, and then the folded sheets were bound together with either wrapped back or side stitching. Printing on both sides of such thin paper, as you can see on the Doctrina, particularly on the left, means it's very difficult to read because you can see the characters coming through the other side, which I think quite possibly suggests these books only survive in European collections, and I think they were sent as demonstration materials back to Europe, and I don't think they were ever really meant to be read, this particular one in particular. Piet van Loon has suggested that Kobo's Shilu was profoundly influenced by an earlier Chinese catechism composed and printed in mainland China under the direction of the Italian Jesuit Michele Ruggieri, the Xiansu Shilu, printed in 1584. But that text, which is printed in Zhaoqing, that is mainland China, adhered to the traditional one-sided format of East Asian printing and includes no illustrations, which is very different than the Shilu. The image program of the Shilu includes not only the frontispiece, a pictorial interpretation of the text's dialogic format between a Dominican priest and his Chinese scholastic interpreter. So an interlocutor, you can see here the priest and the Chinese scholastic are talking. But it also includes a number of diagrams, such as this one, which are derived from European Ptolemaic cosmology, showing the 10 heavens. And this is a kind of image that circulated throughout the Iberian world via printed editions and commentaries on the 13th century scholar Johannes de Sacrobusco's Tratado de la Sfera. Here I'm showing you a 1545 edition printed in Seville. And a number of these woodcuts seem to resemble the Shilu woodcuts very closely. I'm also showing on the right a Mexican, sorry, it's not labeled here, imprint of an Italian translation of the Sfera, which was printed in Mexico by Antonio Ricardo in 1578. But this, the Mexican edition has very few illustrations compared to the Seville one. In contrast, the Chilu, which is printed in 1593, has 4 giant fold-out pages that argue for the spherical shape of the Earth and present information regarding the science of navigation, as well as a number of these fable illustrations, like I showed you the crab. That's also in the same book. But what I want to kind of draw attention to right now is the approach to the image differs really remarkably from other contemporary East Asian books. So this book of medicine, for example, has that same, as a similar kind of circular diagram, but it's using the traditional binding method, so the image is printed on 2 sides of the same page because it's folded, yeah? Another version, you can see another 2-page illustration in an early Chinese book that the illustrator has split the image across 2 separate blocks. So this use of a fold-out page is not something you would ever see in an East Asian book of the period. So the earliest printers in Manila are using imported East Asian papers, probably Chinese papers, wooden matrices to produce these books, and they're likely themselves Chinese immigrants familiar with East Asian modes of book production, where the paper is placed on top of the matrix and rubbed, which is very different from how Western printing is done, where the paper's put below and the matrix comes from above. I'm showing you on left a demonstration I recently went to of how this is done. You can see how he's the block is on the bottom, the paper is laid on top, and then you rub from the back is how you print in East Asia. And you can see evidence of this kind of technique here, where the rubbing is, less pressure has been applied. So it feels like this uneven rubbing indicates we're using this kind of method of printing. And the names of the printers that we do know, so Kang Yong of the Chinese language Doctrina Christiana, his name indicates that he was not baptized and given a Spanish name, so these are probably unconverted Chinese printers producing these books. Yet, within a decade, we have this book, which is printed by a converted Sanglé, who is given a Spanish name, Juan de Vera, and his brother, Pedro, who are known to be converted Sanglés, and they're printing this book in a combination of xylographic, so again, the woodcut matrice, and letterpress printing in the same book, which suggests he either had cast, so he made his own letterpress, or he imported his own letterpress. We don't, more on that in a second. This ambitious work draws on a rich array of printed models that were circulating in Manila, but I want to emphasize this is representing a key technological shift in how books are printed in East Asia and a kind of reorientation towards Western print technologies. The Jesuits had brought a letterpress to Japan in 1590, and before that it was in Macau in 1588. But the Dominicans who made these books in Manila must have relied on local labor to recreate these print technologies via secondhand knowledge. So we have no documented import of any press or any type, although there might be an archival smoking gun somewhere. So look for it. We don't know whether the type was imported or locally made. In China and Japan, at exactly this moment, there is examples of metal type being used and wooden type being made. So it is possible that the type was made locally. The shift to using metal type would have also necessitated the development of new kinds of ink, because in East Asia, if you're printing on wood, you use water-based ink, but you can't use water-based ink on metal type. It will slide off. So you would have had to then also develop ink technology in Manila. And in any case, this appears to have been a relatively specialist practice in the Philippines around 1600. We see the woodcut image used on the left in the Symbolo de la Fe, used again, the exact same woodblock in this later work by a Tagalog printer, Thomas Pinpin, who worked for the Dominicans in Batan across the bay from Manila. The first documented indigenous printer of the Philippines. Pinpin's books were not typically illustrated, so I'm not showing you a lot of them because I'm focusing on images today. But his career, he sets up presses in Laguna, in Binondo, or again, sets up presses, I'm not actually even sure. He might just be moving around with the matrices. It's unclear what setting up a press means in Manila or in the Philippines. But he established the first regular newspaper in Manila by 1637, which is kind of amazing how quickly the growth in print happens in Manila. Now, there are also a lot of archival references to single sheet prints being made in Manila, such as in the Jesuit Carta Annua of 1603, which mentions that on All Saints' Day in 1602, the Jesuit college distributed images of saints, most likely printed images of saints. Now, Retana suggested that the woodcut that you see on the bottom of this title page could have been either used in an earlier now lost edition of a book, Libro de Nuestra Señora del Rosario, that we know existed and was printed, but we have no extant copies of. And he also suggests it probably was a reused block from one of these santos that was being distributed. All this to say, by around 1610, we know that there are prints being made in the Philippines in some considerable quantity. And these prints are being printed on imported paper, and it's likely that they didn't require a full press to be produced. They could have been produced by rubbing. So the way in which Filipino imprints quickly deviated from East Asian illustration, printing, and binding strategies kind of reveal the equal importance of European and New Spanish printed models, and kind of circling back to that anecdote about this New Spanish bookbinder, right? So this anecdote, along with other printed and sculpted evidence, suggests there was an active market for Western printed books in late 16th century Manila. In 1947, a scholar in the Archivo General de la Nación found a 1583 record of 54 books that were sent to a Manila man named Trevina, which used to be interpreted as one man's library. It's a very famous article on one man's library in Manila in book history. But more recent research has indicated or suggested that this guy was actually a book dealer, and he was sending books to Manila. He was sending books across the Pacific. In 1611, we know that the new library of the Colegio de Nuestra Señora del Rosario, that's the Dominican library, was founded with over 30 volumes from Hernando de los Rios Coronel's library, and we see his ex libris and a number of books that survive in the Santo Tomas library in Manila, as well as Marca de Fuegos from another 16th century library that existed in Manila that were disbanded and sent here. We know that there were already established Jesuit, Augustinian, and Archbishopric libraries in Manila by 1610. There's also many scattered references to European prints, books, and other objects being sent to Manila from New Spain as gifts and bequests. So in 1620, the Jesuit procurator in Manila writes to his counterpart in Seville saying, basically, thank you for all the prints you sent me. They're so good. We know that the Bishop of Puerto Rico, Pedro Solier, had been a missionary in the Philippines, and he sends in 1615 a gift of fabric and a box of songbooks to Manila on the galleon for the new Augustinian convent. Another man, a soldier merchant, Pedro de Zuniga, when he dies in 1607, he had imported books. He dies in Manila. He had imported books from New Spain in partnership with a cleric from Mexico City. And his inventory at his death, he owned missals, breviaries, prayer books, Cicero's letters, songbooks, and primers. So there's a kind of scattered references to all this print culture happening in Manila. And we see the impact of this in a number of surviving Filipino printed images as well. So I mentioned the Simbolo de la Fe is a lot of the images in it are copying the earlier Shilu, but then there's also images like this, which are coming from European printed books. So it's drawing from both earlier Filipino imprints and Spanish books, like this sea creature from the 1583 Luis de Granada in version of the Simbolo de la Fe. There's also this incredible anatomical woodcut that's also in the Simbolo de la Fe, printed in Manila, and which looks kind of vaguely like Vesalian anatomical illustrations. So again, just this one book tells us the range of printed material circulating in Manila. There's also evidence in other media that there are single sheet prints circulating in Manila. So this is just a lot of different images from this same book that are all coming from different sources. Marjorie Trusted has identified the printed sources for several surviving ivory plaquettes. So I'm showing you St. Martin of the Beggar here. She's also identified the sources for the Totapulcra ivory plaquette that's at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I've written ad nauseum about this particular print. So there are European engravings clearly available to ivory carvers in Manila, possibly provided by patrons, or they're kind of just acquired. There's a kind of open market. There's also evidence in other kinds of material. There's these beautiful choir stalls in San Agustin in Manila, which are very clearly riffing off of these ornamental print designs, probably from Antwerp. You see similar patterns in wall painting in the same church that was done in the late 16th century. This is the only surviving colonial building in Manila. The city was almost completely leveled in the Second World War, so this is the only kind of in situ stuff we have. So while European imported single sheet prints from the 16th and 17th century don't survive at all in Manila, there's none besides books in Santo Tomas Library. These other kinds of related objects help us reconstruct the variety of prints, printed books and single sheet prints that must have been available around the turn of the 17th century in the archipelago. So I began this talk with a compilation of Spanish anecdotes about the mimetic faculties of Sangle and indigenous American artists. But investigating the production and consumption of printed material in early colonial Manila challenges the narrative proposed by Salazar. Sangle printers took their experience and knowledge of Chinese book cultures, as well as the models brought by Spaniards on the Manila galleon, to make entirely new types of prints, combining locally made letterpress printing, perhaps, or at least locally utilized letterpress printing, with xylographic methods used in Asia, iconographic and decorative schemes from prints and books from New Spain and from Europe. Salazar's story about the poor bookbinder compelled to return home to New Spain because he had been commercially outmaneuvered by his Chinese assistant is something of a parable of colonial printmaking in Manila, as it was an industry that appears to have relied almost entirely on immigrant Chinese and Tagalog labor and ingenuity, rather than relying on European immigrants or even solely European models. While the church and the monastic orders financed many of the earliest known printed products of the Spanish Philippines, the production of the prints, from the sourcing of the paper, possibly including the fabrication of the presses and the type, to the execution of the woodblocks, all relied on local labor. The varied careers of the Sangle de Vera brothers and the Tagalog Thomas Pinpin suggest that these earliest printmakers and printers in the Philippines were very savvy businessmen who saw the commercial potential of the printing industry and were willing to experiment technically and formally. In the case of de Vera, possibly his combining of letterpress and xylographic techniques, and in Pinpin's case, the development of an idea of a newspaper. Reconstructing the print culture of early modern Manila requires an expanded geographic and material frame. And what I've outlined here is only a very, very rough beginning, but I hope it indicates the potential of such approach, connecting surviving printed images, carvings, and other artworks to potentially printed models hailing from different places in East Asia, Europe, and the Americas. And as a sort of mini coda to this reconstruction of early Filipino print culture, I'd like to briefly compare how the production of printed images and of ivory carvings in Manila both relied on this kind of global trade, disparate and connected markets, immigrant and local creative labor. And this kind of allows us to come back to the questions of Salazar's anecdote and early modern globalization, not just as a description of objects and people moving across the Pacific, but as a kind of epistemic shift in how people understood the world as connected, as one market, where labor and capital are mobile. Archival references to ivory carving in the colonial Philippines are very few and far between. We have zero artist names, no concrete sense of how the workshops operated, or the precise ethnic identity of the carvers. Although the ever helpful Salazar and subsequent Spanish administrators usually describe immigrant Chinese Sangles as responsible for all the artistic labor of the Philippines. But what we do have is a considerable corpus of sculptures in the Philippines, in Latin America, and in Europe, which is sort of the inverse of early Filipino imprints where we have very few surviving books and prints made in the Philippines, and there's what we have are in European collections, but we have many archival traces. So it's like they're two halves of the same story. But I think from close material and visual analysis of these ivory sculptures, like the prints made in the archipelago, we also have evidence of the kind of incredible innovation of these immigrant communities looking, in this case, across the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. So the elephant ivory that's used to produce these sculptures, most of it came from South Asia. We have records of the Kingdom of Cambodia sending ivory tributes to Manila, as well as some of this ivory came from Africa. The size of the tusks indicates that's African origin, and you can only know truly by genetic testing. I would love to have the Guadalupe one tested. If it's African ivory, it's big, so it seems like it should be. The carving of ivory itself was a well-established Chinese practice, but carvers in Manila, I want to emphasize, they move very, very quickly from doing these sculptures of one tusk, one monolithic sculpture, to something like this figure in Baltimore, which has 17 pieces of ivory that are connected together via dowels and glue. It's a very different kind of object. And to really kind of emphasize this, nothing like these kinds of sculptures are being made anywhere else in the world at this moment. The complexity of their construction, the nature of the material of ivory on this scale. Artists in the early modern Philippines, many of them likely Chinese immigrants, are creating an entirely new form of art object for use in domestic churches, but mostly, I think, for the export market, for Latin America. And this happens very, very quickly. And we know this because of the 1601 wreck of the Santa Margarita, the Manila galleon ship, where there are a lot of ivories that were recovered from the forecastle that are not indicated on any other written record. So this is our material history. They're severely abraded under their time underwater, but we have, these single figure sculptures as well as a number of triptychs and plaquettes. I want to draw your attention to the figure at upper left, the Saint Jerome, which there's a number of ivories that survive in Latin American collections that replicate this exact iconography, or very similar iconography, with the kneeling figure of the hermit saint whose left hand grasps a crucifix, his right hand is flung out beside him. You have this weird little lion kind of wedged into the corner. And this scene always has this kind of arch that's formed by the cardinal's hat and his robe. And usually there's the figure of God the Father at top, right? Similarly, we see multiple versions of the Totapulcra iconography and ivory sculptures. The one on the far left is that 1601 shipwreck, one pulled from the floor of the ocean. The one in the middle is from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the one on the right is from a private collection here. So we have multiple versions of similar iconographies being produced by about 1600, which to me indicates that these are already ivory carvers in Manila are looking to New Spain as an export market, and they're producing multiple versions of the same iconography to be pushed out. So there's a community of artists and artisans in Manila around 1600 already, working in multiple media who understood their place within an interlocking regional and global economy. Printmakers who are combining East Asian and Western print technologies, ivory carvers that are taking imported materials and models to address markets from across the Pacific Ocean. So, an immigrant Chinese bookbinder who learns his trade from another immigrant from New Spain and quickly displaces him, right? These are all narratives of early modern globalization, evidence not just of the extraordinary mobility of technologies, of goods and people, but of how creative labor from so-called peripheries of the Iberian world could intervene, disrupt, and exploit these colonial economic systems like the galleon trade. That's it. Thanks.
Muchas gracias. Encuentro fantásticas esas historias conectadas entre la producción de libros para la evangelización temprana en la Nueva España y lo que nos presentas tú aquí. También en esta movilidad de la que hablas, ¿no? Es diferente, digamos, como operó el envío de los marfiles, pero bueno, pensar en este momento de este tipo de movilidad creo que es fundamental también en los temas. Antes de abrir la palabra también quisiera mencionar que me pareció muy interesante este libro de Cobo que nos presentas, sobre todo porque tiene inscripciones como instrucciones en español, ¿no? Pensar eso, si estos libros que llegan, también podemos pensar en posiblemente un productor inmigrante que comienza con una industria, no lo sé, quizás eso podría ser, pero bueno, dejo la palabra para quien quiera hacerle una pregunta a Stephanie.
Oh, claro que sí. Sí. Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. Okay, so I'm wondering about the connection between sort of the technical know-how for the print production that's happening and then the technical know-how for the ivory carving. I wasn't quite sure for the print production. Do you think this is still wood block, or is it possible to tell? And is there any sense of sort of technical overlap between those two media?
I think that's a great question and one I really want to answer. I don't have the answer to it yet. I think most of the very earliest printed images are xylographic, so they're wood blocks. So the same technology they would have used in China, same thing. But like the case of the ivories, I think very quickly there's this idea that, oh, we have to print using Western letters, and they're seeing printed books. And so I think somebody, and it's unclear to me, Pedro de Vera is the first known version, but I'm not sure if he's the first, whether the Dominicans get hold of a letter font, or if they decide that they're going to commission a letter font, I don't know. But it does seem it's a very related skill, right? It's incision and carving. And in the Somos Pacifico exhibition, there are these beautiful wooden pilasters of figures that to me are very, very similar to how the ivories are carved. So this kind of shared interest in carving, I think, is what is in my brain kind of connecting these two things, as well as this idea of taking multiple technical inputs and creating a new thing.
I have wow. Hi. I have one sort of observation or something, and then I have a really, really nerdy technical question. So on the picture we're seeing here of the Doctrina Cristiana en Lengua Española y Tagalog, the first thing that you started with, the border, that's all woodcut,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so that's interesting because even just in comparison to what we have on the screen, but in other examples like the Mexican imprints, like the reason you get ornamental borders is to use up like type that's sitting around and just add spacers. So it's interesting to think about something that's like practical and purely functional than having to be engineered into the wood as one unit.
Yeah, and this is why I think they're looking at those books.
Yeah.
Because in the Chinese printing tradition, there's no decorative border tradition. So this first, and again, that whole book is, every page is xylographically printed. So every word in Tagalog is printed, is carved. So the whole page is one block.
Super interesting.
And so they carve that whole thing as one block.
Right. Then my other question, my actual question, is that you mentioned that you could have wood type or metal type, which in the Western tradition, we have like very, very, very little evidence of wood type ever used. So this is something that is so far outside of my area of expertise. But my question is basically, on a technical level, working from the imprint alone, can we tell based on squash and any of that, the difference between metal type and wood type, but also whether a press is involved in that operation or not?
Book historians of East Asia say that they can tell. I have not figured it out yet. So this is one of the things where the book history of East Asian book printing, wooden type is being carved in Japan at exactly this moment, like precisely this moment, like 1590, around 1590. And there's also wooden type being produced in southern China. Book historians say, oh, and this is produced in wooden type, this is produced in wooden type. But I don't read Japanese. It's also like hard for me to like interpret the text. So, but the book history people, which is why I'd love to like sit with some book history people and be like, why? How can you tell that this is wooden type versus metal type? There's also ceramic type being used in Korea.
Whoa.
So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
is the-
Okay.
but it's like definitely something I'm thinking about because it produces a whole related set of other questions, right? So if it's metal type, then you have to talk about ink. And that'll be soon because there's definitely metal type
Yeah.
printed stuff later. So it's like the question of ink,
Yeah.
the question of who's making the fonts. There's a pretty well-established metalworking tradition in the Philippines. So it's not impossible that they could have cast metal type. Metal type is being cast in southern China and in Japan. But it is this question of like what, if one knows that this was wooden type or
Yeah.
metal type, it would help with those
I
questions.
guess the only thing I would add to that is just methodologically thinking about these interconnected histories is so interesting because obviously you, both of us, have spent a lot of time dealing with technical stuff of Western print. So to face the kind of basic technical question that you're suddenly then like, I have no idea I have no idea even what I'm looking at, points to sort of like the difficulty of working in these spaces. So just thank you for that. It's really interesting.
Well, I mean, I think when I realized that Eastern print is the paper goes on top, I was like,
Yeah.
that's what?
Yeah.
And that in East Asian printing, it's mobile. You can move the blocks
Right.
because you don't need a press.
Right. It's not bound to pressure.
So this
like a
idea
press.
that this doctrina, they could be printing this, they just take the block. It's not actually that long. The doctrina is
Right.
like, I think it's 22 blocks or
Right.
something. They could carry that anywhere and print it anywhere.
Totally. Like,
And the printing, it's one guy.
Right.
It's not not a machine.
right.
So
Super interesting.
this thinking of print as requiring technical infrastructure, requiring a fixed shop, high level of capital, it's not the case in East
Yeah.
Asia.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Tenemos una pregunta en línea. Thank you for this presentation. I have a question. There are any documentation of Sangli artists that traveled to New Spain? And do we know if any ivory carving was made in the New Spain?
I have theories. I don't know, but I don't think that it is impossible that there are records. We know that so many Sangles came to New Spain on the galleon. It seems completely plausible to me that the artisans would also come. There are, I should have put them in the Tovar de Teresa House Museum, there are small St. Jerome's, very similar to the St. Jerome's I just showed you, but they're very small. And they have wooden backings. And I think that they might be New Spanish carvers working with ivory offcuts that have broke. These things are constantly breaking to make small versions of those Filipino ones. Because the Filipino ones are never smaller than about this big. And these ones are this big, which is much closer to New Spanish micro wood carvings than anything that's happening in Manila. So there are these objects that suggest that you have New Spanish carvers, or maybe they're from Manila. What do you say? Maybe they're Manila carvers that have immigrated here and then are producing these kind of hybrid objects with a little bit of ivory and a little bit of wood. But that's a suggestion. I don't know.
The question have another part. Carving similar to the artist working alabaster to look like ivory, like Diego Reynoso.
See, so Diego Reynoso I'm fascinated by these. There's two alabaster, but one of them has the one in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It says it has walrus ivory or something else, other kind of bone. In it, there are these 3 documented, one, I don't know where it is, but I've seen 2 of them that are very similar. The carving techniques are very similar. They have the forms of clouds. Oh, I probably have it on another PowerPoint somewhere. But and the kind of drill marks that are very similar to Filipino carvings, but have these signatures on the back, Diego de Reynoso, and a date, 1670s, I think. And which suggests there's either a local artist here who's looking at these ivories and producing something, or again, it's a Sangle artist who's converted. They all have Hispanic names. So it's very hard to tell from a name Juan de Vera, if you looked at this frontispiece, you would not know he was a Sangle. We know in letters that he's referred to as a Sangle. There's no other way we would know because you converted, you take a Spanish name. So it's very difficult to parse ethnic identity. In the case of Thomas Pinpin, the name is Tagalog. And in Tagalog history, this is a very important figure. But yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I think really needs archival research here about the communities of carvers working in bone or alabaster.
And in order to understand this fashion for ivory things, have you doing some research on the inventories of the wealthy families in New Spain?
So I've done a little, there are donations, church donations, often people tied to the Philippines who donate in Badajoz and in Badajoz, and there's another place in Extraordinaria that they are donating ivory sculptures, and they have some connection to Manila usually. And that's in the 1660s, 1680s, that are, that they're wealthy donations. But I haven't, the domestic ownership is a little fuzzier, but I think there's so many projects one could do. I'm like looking at the students, like from Acapulco here, like the resale prices, like what is the market for ivories in New Spain? How much are they sold for? Do we have any inventories that list them? What are the price? Because I think this is a question of, I know how much they were in the middle of the 17th century in insurance claims, but not in terms of actual market price here. Whether people had them domestically, were they only owned in churches? Like, there's lots of open questions that I think archival research could help with. So.
Olvidé decirles, pero pueden hacer sus preguntas en español.
Sí, sí.
El grabado que aparece en la esquina es de la Virgen de la Antigua.
Oh, sí. But made in Japan.
Made
Sorry.
in Japan.
This is,
¿Nos puedes hablar un poquito de ese grabado, de dónde lo sacas?
Yeah. So there's another part to this where there's also Japanese immigrants to the Philippines. I cut it out because it's too complicated. Especially after the Christians are expelled, that are in Manila. And there is the earliest engravings made in Manila, to me, look like the Japanese one. So I think the earliest engravers in the Philippines are possibly Japanese. But that's another thing. But yes, that is Virreinal Antigua. And it says on the bottom, the Seminario Yapan on the bottom, and it's dated 1597. And it's in one impression in Nagasaki. But it's, I've only seen it under glass from this far, so I need to look at it properly. But the estampidas that are in Santo Tomas in the library in Manila, I think are very similar. This kind of short mark, the way it's not as, this is more ambitious, the one that's made in Japan, in terms of the pattern, but the way that the burin is used is very similar in the Filipino examples from 1610 or 1615.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Pues no veo otra. Creo que tampoco tenemos otra en internet. Entonces, bueno, pues muchísimas gracias otra vez.
Okay.
Sí.
I forgot.